Harry. Okay, what's your fifth and final tip for us, please?
So, having railed against the abstract, this is maybe the most abstract, but I think there's something in it, so bear with me. So it maintain perspective, and concretely finding a way of stopping, reminding yourself what matters, looking after yourself, and looking at situations afresh. So I think there are different bits of this. One is around like changing your mind. So if you like interviewed 10 year ago me now and I was listening to it, I'd be like, who's that fool and why does he think those stupid things he thinks? I've changed my mind about almost everything in education, sometimes more than once, and whatever you think as a listener, there's a good chance that, and at least some things, you might do the same at different points. So there's a point there of, don't work as hard as you can, do as well as you can in the moment, but being willing to try out alternative things, test alternative things, accept that you might be able to learn from people who think the diametric opposite of you. And then I think tied to this, there's a sort of workload, well-being perspective point of saying, like, you get really caught up in there's one student, there's one class, this year's GCSE results, whatever it is, and if we didn't get a bit caught up in that, we wouldn't do great work, and so that's important. But making space and knowing, like, there's the rest of the world, there's our families to think about, there's whatever else we enjoy in life, and that kind of thing of maintaining perspective and like living a decent life, being important around teaching. And I think that also ties to something I did a project years ago where I was interviewing teachers who'd been really successful in quite tricky schools as new teachers, and one of the things that came through was this idea of, like, we called it wiping the slate clean, that they get to the end of the day, they like wipe the slate clean, come back tomorrow, have a fresh start, give themselves a new chance, give their students a new chance. So something around that of, like, again, taking a step back and giving yourself a break, like sometimes, all the time, in between lessons, you name it.
Lovely. Right, okay, a couple of questions on this one, Harry. So changing your mind's an interesting one. I've changed my mind many times. What was it for you? What is it for you that causes you to change your mind? What needs to happen? And how do you then go about, if it's like a real kind of long-standing belief, how do you go about almost kind of building it into a habit that, okay, now I'm going to do something differently? Because that feels difficult.
It's a slow process, isn't it? I mean, it's probably a thing of threshold concepts, and, threshold concepts being troublesome and irreversible and transformational and integrative, and it's this troublesome thing, like, you see a thing and it nags at you and you're like, something's not quite right here, but you don't know what it is, and then and so, like, to go from the point where you don't know what it is to where you do know what it is, a lot of different things have to happen. So maybe I need to come and see you doing something different in my classroom. Maybe you need to also pop into my lesson and say, have you thought about this? Maybe I also need to read a book, and those things need to come together in a way, it's a sort of a light bulb moment, insight thing that is very hard to predict. Like, it's you could sit and say, I'm going to teach Harry the basics of cognitive load theory in this 20-minute period, but the thing of, like, re-envisaging the whole way you teach around cognitive load is a thing that's going to be much slower. So there's a thing around patience, there's a thing around willingness to learn and just, like, read some of what your opponents, those who you don't believe in, are writing and thinking, and a willingness to try stuff out, I guess, and learn from that. But can I fire, I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, can I fire it back at you? Because, you wrote a whole book around this. I promised I'd get another plug in for the excellent book How I Wish I Taught Maths, which I genuinely recommend to people who are both are and aren't maths teachers. What was your experience? Because it was 12 years. Obviously, a lot of it was sort of backloaded, wasn't it? Because you spend a few years doing your Swiss rolls, and then it's only later on you're like, oh, this, maybe wasn't the best way to do it. What helped you to make those changes?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Harry. I think part of it was a gradual shift. Over time, I was thinking, I'm not convinced by this. The results were still fine. The kids were still enjoying their lessons, but I was never getting through as much as I hoped. And often I'd be really excited about teaching kids a concept, but And then I'd think, what's a fun activity to design around this? And they never quite get as excited as I hoped they would do, and so on. So there's a definite gradual shift going on. But then also there was kind of a bit of a jolt, which would be when I started to speak to people who knew far more about stuff than I did. And I think I was lucky I did that via the podcast, but I think Twitter's a great kind of place for this now. And as you say, purposely going out of your way to find smart people who disagree with your point of view and thinking, well, why do they disagree? And is it worth trying it? But I think the real danger is, I mean, I had a definite incentive because I did it in quite a public way. I was speaking to people and I kind of thought, right, well, I do actually have to go off and try something different here. But I think there's a real danger, and I don't know if you agree with this, just as teachers, it's quite easy to avoid doing that change, particularly if your results are fine, you're ticking along nicely, because making a change is difficult, it's often time consuming, it's risky, you often get this short-term dip in either performance or whatever, or however you label it. It takes something, doesn't it, to make a change as a kind of busy full-time teacher. It's really hard, I find. I don't know if you agree.
Well, particularly when you're renouncing things that you've believed in. So, like, by changing what I do now, I'm basically saying I gave last year's year 11 a bad deal.
Yes.
And that's incredibly uncomfortable. So that's again where I think it's like, you know, you take a long time potentially denying things, even as it's gradually dawning on you. I think that point of getting on Twitter and finding people you disagree, which obviously on Twitter it's easy to find people who disagree with you, like so the smart people who disagree with you. I think one thing that's been really helpful to me is a different change in perspective, which is what Scott Alexander who would say is the difference between conflict and mistake theory. So he'd say, like, one reason why we don't agree on anything is conflict theory, that, like, people are out to get each other. So in politics, it's like, you know, the rich are out to get the poor and whoever's getting. And, you know, in schools, it's like the leaders are out to get us and the kids are out to get us and so on. And he'd say mistake theory is more around, like, life is just hard and it's hard to get things right. So maybe the government are incompetent because they're, like, malicious, deliberately trying to ruin everything, and it's always hard to rule that out. But maybe governing a country is just incredibly difficult, and so many of the screw-ups are just because people, just like ourselves, are tired, overworked and screwing things up. And in the same way, maybe school leaders are awful human beings who, you know, were just trying to ruin our lives, or maybe running a school is incredibly difficult and it's hard to get right. And so for me, seeing more things in terms of mistake theory than conflict theory has been quite helpful, because it allows me, I think, to learn a little bit more from others and maybe to be a little bit more humble about, like that clash. But even, you know, like a conflict theorist would say, you know, I've just sold out to the, you know, whoever it is. So it's a hard one to push.
It's lovely that, Harry. A final question just from me on this particular tip. You mentioned well-being, and that's something over the course of this podcast and these videos I really want to dig into, because it's a massive part of being a teacher and something that's potentially overlooked. What are some of the things, again, you can speak for this personally yourself or work that you've done with other teachers, that teachers can do practically that help kind of leave the job in the school, if that makes sense? And it's difficult to do because we've got to sometimes take the job home for marking, but I'm talking more about leaving the bad times and kind of switching off and so on. Is there anything you do yourself or that you've observed other teachers do practically that help for this?
So in my first school, sat down with the head teacher before I came in with some of the new teachers, and he was retiring, so he was sort of like, you know, talking about various things. But he made this throwaway comment around maybe one of the reasons so many teachers cycle is so they can't take books home with them, and it was one of the things that inspired me to start cycling to school a year or two later. But there's something in that, and it's not to do with necessarily not taking work home, because as you know, as you find with a young family, maybe you want to do pick up and then do some work, but it's around, I think, some kind of bright lines of knowing where your limits are, and so I now have like quite elastic limits because I do a couple of different jobs and I have to try and keep a lot of different people happy, but at least trying to be clear, like, there are certain periods of time, so I normally have my son on a Thursday, and during that day I won't be looking at anything, even if I'm happy to work at other random strange times. So working out a clear set of limits. I think making space for nice things, so one of the most useful and powerful things that I learnt to do when I was having quite a tough year was in the middle of the working day, you've got lunch, you could sit at your desk and do 15 minutes more work, but it won't be very good work. And go for a walk. And I was quite lucky, there were areas of green space round the corner from where I was. Go out, walk 15 minutes, and just come back like a happier, better person. And so, you know, like, you might not be lucky enough to live next to or have a school next to a park in that way, but finding, like, what's the really nice thing you can do in the middle of the day that isn't just more of the same? Because actually, if you've been at your desk since 7:30 and it's 1:30 and you've taught 4 lessons, you're not going to do your best lesson planning or anything. And I said this to someone the other day, he's an assistant head now, and he's like, well, I've always been ahead of year, so I just couldn't do that. But if you are ahead of year and you've got a free, maybe if you've got one of your frees that's allocated and you can take 10 minutes, just go and, like, make yourself a posh coffee. Like, see more and more posh coffee machines in schools. Make yourself a posh coffee. Like, so like, finding little things that are going to give you a little bit of pleasure.
Yeah.
So I throw those out to you.
I like it, Harry. That's fantastic.